The most powerful military in human history, 11 aircraft carrier strike groups, 800 overseas bases, a defense budget larger than the next 10 countries combined, a nuclear arsenal capable of ending civilization 17 times over. That is the United States military. And right now, that military cannot open a waterway 21 miles wide. Let that land for a second. 21 miles. That is the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz. 21 miles of water, and the entire United States Navy, with its destroyers and its submarines and its F-35s and its satellite surveillance and its 50,000 troops, cannot force that 21 miles back open. 800 tankers are sitting trapped in the Persian Gulf right now, going nowhere. 20% of the world's oil frozen. Brent crude crossed $100 a barrel. The EU is bleeding 500 million euros every single day. Goldman Sachs is warning of a 30% chance of American recession within 12 months. And who is holding that choke point closed? Not Russia, not China, not some peer superpower with carriers and nukes of their own. Iran, a country with a GDP smaller than the state of Texas, a country whose air force is flying planes designed in 1953. That country, right now, today, has the most powerful military machine ever assembled by human civilization, stuck, frozen, waiting. Now, I want to be very precise here because it would be easy and lazy to look at this situation and say America is simply losing. That is not exactly what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is more specific and more disturbing than that. America is not losing because of bad luck or bad strategy alone. America is losing because several of the structural foundations that its military power depends on are through those foundations one by one, so that by the end you understand exactly where the cracks are and why they are very difficult to repair quickly. Okay, let's get into it. The first breakdown is in the American command structure itself. And I want you to understand this is not normal. What is happening inside the Pentagon right now has not happened in living memory during active combat. Secretary of the Navy John Phelan fired immediately. No public explanation. Right in the middle of naval blockade operations when the Navy is carrying the heaviest operational burden of this war. Before that, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth fired General Randy George, the highest-ranking uniformed officer in the entire United States Army. Two of the most senior figures in the American military chain of command removed during a war. Think about what that means practically. Every commander below those men now knows that disagreeing with civilian leadership is career-ending. That means the people actually running this war, the generals and admirals on the ground, are now in a position where they must choose between telling their bosses the truth about what is and is not working, or keeping their jobs. That is a devastating position for a military institution to be in, and I'll tell you what I think that rupture is actually about. The professional military understands logistics. They understand production cycles. They understand what it costs to sustain a long campaign against a deeply dug-in opponent. And some of them, not all, but some, have been telling their civilian bosses the mathematics of this war are not in our favor. We are consuming resources faster than we can replace them. This is not a sustainable trajectory, and the civilian leadership's answer is, "You're fired." That is the first breakdown, and it is serious. The second breakdown is in the weapon stockpile, and this one has a very specific number attached to it that I want you to remember. Iran is producing 100 ballistic missiles per month. The United States is producing 6 to 7 interceptor missiles in that same period. 100 versus 6 or 7 every single month. We covered the cost mathematics of that equation in our last session. What I want to focus on today is what that production gap means for the long-term capacity to fight. The EU Defense Commissioner has publicly confirmed that the American military is, in her exact words, overstretched. The United States defense industry has had to quadruple its weapons production capacity just to avoid running out of interceptor systems entirely. Quadruple. And even that enormous acceleration is still not enough to close the gap. Now, here is what makes this worse. The American military is not fighting one war. It is simultaneously trying to support Ukraine, protect Gulf allies, maintain deterrence against China in the Pacific, and fight Iran. Every missile sent to one front is a missile not available somewhere else. The system was not designed to sustain this level of simultaneous demand, and the cracks are showing. That is the second breakdown. Resource exhaustion spreading across multiple theaters at the same time. The third breakdown is perhaps the most underreported, and it comes from the seafloor. The Pentagon has shared an assessment with the House Armed Services Committee in a classified briefing that Rafa 302 AO Blade Hormuz could have been sold tongue. 6 months. That number shocked both Democratic and Republican members of Congress who attended that briefing, according to sources familiar with the discussion. Here is why that number is so significant. The assessment reveals that Iran has placed at least 20 mines, and possibly many more, in and around the Strait of Hormuz. Several of these mines are GPS-guided and remotely controlled. That is not improvised. That is a sophisticated, deliberate, pre-planned denial strategy. Iran did not mine the strait in a panic when the war started. Iran mined it with precision tools designed specifically to make the clearing operation as slow and dangerous as possible. And the Pentagon's own assessment says that mine clearing operations probably cannot even begin until after the war ends. Let me explain what that means strategically. If the mines cannot be cleared for 6 months after the ceasefire, and a ceasefire has not even been agreed yet, then the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed not just for the duration of this conflict, but for a significant period after it ends. The global economy does not get a quick recovery. The oil markets do not normalize overnight. Every country that depends on energy flowing through that choke point is looking at a year or more of disruption, minimum. The United Kingdom has already announced it is sending a minesweeper. That is one ship against at least 20 GPS-guided mines in one of the most contested waterways on Earth. The mathematics of that problem are not encouraging. That is the third breakdown. And unlike firing a general or ordering more missile production, you cannot solve a minefield with a press release. The fourth breakdown brings in a factor that most Western analysts are seriously underestimating, and that is the role of China. Now, I want to be precise here, because China has been very careful about how it positions itself in this conflict. Beijing has not sent troops. It has not formally supplied heavy weapons. It has maintained publicly a posture of neutrality and peace mediation. But underneath that posture, China has been functioning as the structural lifeline that is keeping Iran's war machine operational. Let me give you the specifics. First, guidance systems. Iran's ballistic missiles and drones have shown a level of precision accuracy that surprised American military planners. That accuracy does not come from Iranian technology alone. Since 2021, China has given Iran full military access to the Beidou navigation satellite system, China's equivalent of GPS, but with encrypted military-grade signals. When American forces tried to jam Iranian GPS guidance during attacks, it did not work because Iran was not using GPS. It was using Beidou, Chinese satellites, signals the Americans cannot block. Beyond navigation, Iran has been receiving imagery from Chinese satellite networks, including the Jilin-1 commercial constellation and military reconnaissance systems, giving the IRGC real-time intelligence on the movement of American naval assets. The Revolutionary Guard bought a high-resolution reconnaissance satellite manufactured by the Chinese company EarthEye. That satellite has been feeding them targeting data throughout this conflict. Second, fuel for the missiles themselves. Despite the war, Chinese ships were allowed to leave the port of Gwadar loaded with thousands of tons of sodium perchlorate, a key precursor chemical used to manufacture solid rocket fuel. The blockade is supposed to be cutting off Iran's warfighting capacity, but the rockets Iran is firing at American assets are being refueled by supply chains that run through Chinese ports. Third, the financial system. China purchases approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. In 2025 alone, that informal trade was worth approximately $31.2 billion, representing roughly 45% of the entire Iranian government budget. That is not trade, that is a subsidy. Without Chinese oil purchases, Iran's government runs out of money to pay its soldiers, fund its missiles, and sustain its military operations within months. And China has constructed an entire parallel financial architecture to make sure that money keeps flowing regardless of American sanctions. Iranian oil revenues are processed through shell companies and banks in Hong Kong and mainland China, converted into RMB, and fed back into the global financial system in ways that American Treasury sanctions cannot easily track or intercept. Fourth, diplomatic protection. When Arab states and the United States pushed Resolution 2817 at the UN Security Council condemning Iran's attacks on Gulf infrastructure, China voted to abstain, calling the resolution unbalanced. When Bahrain sponsored a draft resolution that would have given legal legitimacy to a military operation to force open the Strait of Hormuz, China and Russia jointly vetoed it. Without that veto, the legal and political framework for a broader coalition operation against Iran's mining campaign would have been much easier to assemble. Now, here is what I want you to understand about why China is doing this. China is not doing this because it loves Iran. China is doing this because it is a rational actor pursuing its own interests. And China's interests right now is to see the United States military exhausted, overextended, and humiliated, without China having to fire a single shot or spend a single soldier. Every day this war continues, America burns through missiles, money, political capital, and allied goodwill. Every day this war continues, the credibility of American military deterrence in Taiwan, in the South China Sea, in the Pacific, erodes a little further. Every day this war continues, more countries quietly update their strategic calculations about whether American security guarantees are still worth the cost of alliance. China is watching America fight Iran the same way a chess player watches his opponent spend all his pieces taking a pawn. It costs China almost nothing, and it weakens the board position of its primary adversary enormously. And here is the specific operational consequence of China's involvement that I want you to sit with. The American naval blockade, the central instrument of coercive pressure in this conflict, is predicated on the assumption that cutting off Iran's oil exports will drain Iran's financial capacity to sustain the war. That is the logic. That is the theory. Cut the money, cut the will to fight. But that theory only works if the blockade actually cuts the money. In 2025, China imported approximately $31.2 billion worth of Iranian crude oil through informal channels. That number, $31 billion, represents roughly 45% of the entire Iranian government budget, nearly half. Which means that even with an American naval blockade in place, even with dozens of ships being turned around, even with CENTCOM claiming success, Iran still has access to a financial lifeline worth nearly half its government spending through Chinese oil purchases that bypass the dollar system entirely. The shadow fleet runs out of Chinese ports. The tankers turn off their tracking systems. The money flows through Hong Kong shell companies. And the Revolutionary Guard continues to pay its soldiers, manufacture its missiles, and maintain its position in the strait. You cannot blockade a country that has the world's second-largest economy as its silent financial partner. The math simply does not work. And this is something that American strategic planners either failed to account for adequately or knew and could not publicly admit because admitting it would mean acknowledging that the blockade cannot achieve its stated objective. That is the fourth breakdown. America is not just fighting Iran. America is fighting Iran while China systematically undermines every pressure point America is trying to apply. Now, let's put these four breakdowns together and look at the overall picture. Because when you stack them on top of each other, what you see breaking down simultaneously. And today, I want to walk